Today we're going to discuss a German school called the Bauhaus. The existence of the Bauhaus and the activities at the Bauhaus are critically important for all aspects of design in the 20th century. The reason the Bauhaus is so important is it's in a sense a crucible. It's a place where after World War I, the advanced visual ideas in Europe were thrown together and mixed up. They were mixed up in the context of a Germany that had been defeated in a devastating war. After Germany was defeated in World War I, a peace treaty was negotiated that took large areas of Germany. The coal-rich provinces to the west were given to France. Poland was given a corridor to the sea that slashed right up through Germany. So the land area of the German nation was decimated. This was a serious blow to German national pride and to the German people. Reparations were required to be paid to the victor nations. For example, trains, German trains, would be loaded with cattle, just filled up with cattle, as many cows as you could get on them. They would head off for France. They would never come back. The French kept the cows and the trains. Trains would be brought to factories, and the machinery for printing, for making clothes, for making shoes, would be loaded onto the cars. The trains would go to France or go to the other nations. So there was economic devastation. When we talked about the style, we talked about the idea of building a new man and a new society in the face of this devastation of the war. This feeling was doubly true in Germany. And so the existence of a design school that had a sense of mission about applying design and art to the problems of contemporary life became a very serious and very real issue. Let's go now to the slides. This gentleman is Henry van der Velde. He was a Belgian architect, graphic designer, artist, painter. He had gone to Weimar, Germany, and become head of the Weimar School of Arts and Crafts. When World War I broke out, this very brilliant designer and architect, who had been very innovative in his use of materials and his philosophy of art, recommended some people who might take over. On the list was 31-year-old Walter Gropius. As it happened, the Weimar School closed for the duration of the war. After the war, the Weimar Schools of Arts and Crafts and the Fine Arts Academy were merged into one school. The young architect Walter Gropius was appointed to become the director of the new school, which was named the Bauhaus. There was in Germany at the time a real sense of the need to apply art to the problems of an industrial nation. Pardon me, would you like to move to another seat? I think you're right in the line of the slide there. There was an understanding that industrialism was out of hand and that something had to be done to improve the artistic quality of the built environment, of manufactured objects, of communications in society. An architect, Hermann Muthesius, was instrumental in organizing what became known as the Deutsche Werkbund. This was an organization that was dedicated to bringing art to industrial society. It was made up of industry officials, educators, critics, artists, architects, This poster was designed by Peter Behrens, and we see a legend there: art and craft, industry and commerce, architecture. So the Dunstwerkbund became a very important sort of linchpin or key upon which the notion of the Bauhaus school was to be based. This poster is very allegorical. That man riding a horse and holding a torch becomes a symbol for enlightenment and progress. Walter Gropius, upon becoming director of the Bauhaus, though he was only 31 years old, had an international reputation as an architect. He had apprenticed in Peter Behrens' architectural office and then left that office to go on his own. This 1911 building, the Fagus factory, demonstrates some of the ideas that Walter Gropius was working with as an architect. He was working with the notion of functionalism. He was one of a growing number of people who believed that in design and an industrial society, form follows function. That is, design should be very rational. The designer should be totally preoccupied with intellectually determining what the need is and what the function is, and then solving the problem of that function. We note that this building is essentially stripped of ornament and decoration, even though this is 1911, and Victorian architecture, Art Nouveau architecture are still very much in vogue. We find that all decoration and ornament is stripped from this building. Gropius was very much interested in the notion of machine manufacture and fabrication. These large areas of windows are what architecturally we would call a curtain wall. Curtain wall architecture is architecture in which a structure is built, usually out of steel I-beams, and then the walls are not load-bearing or support walls. Rather, they become skins or curtains that close off the space, keep your heat and air inside, keep people from falling off the 21st story of the building. As we examine these window units, these curtain walls, we become aware of the fact that the components that make up these walls, the aluminum windows with glass, and then the panels, are factory manufactured components. Gropius, in a sense, placed an order for so many dozen of these panels, so many dozen of these window units, and these items were manufactured in a factory and then shipped to the building site where they were assembled. This is by now a very common practice in architecture, moving away from handicraft. We build most houses, domestic homes, still today by the handicraft method, where men with hammers go out and nail together sticks by hand. Here we have industrial manufacture operative in architecture. Here's another building. This was an exhibition building for the Werkbund in 1914. It was a model factory and office demonstration building. Note at the end of this office building how metal support structures hold curved panes of glass around a cantilevered stairwell. So this becomes a completely open, luminous area with natural daylight. In the factory portion of the exhibition building in the back, you can see from this roof that there are no posts interfering with the factory floor and the manufacturing area. Rather, there's a big cantilevered triangular structure. It becomes very open and very functional in terms of the use. This woodcut by the American Lionel Finninger who had gone over and joined the faculty of the Bauhaus, is very expressionistic. The early days of the Bauhaus were strongly based on expressionistic art. The subject matter here is a cathedral. It's very stylized, has a strong quality of cubism about it. This was the cover for the first Bauhaus manifesto. In this manifesto, Walter Gropius, the first director of the Bauhaus, set forth the purpose of the Bauhaus, its philosophy. This philosophy existed during its early years. It changed later. Basically, the concept was that the complete building is the goal of all the arts. Gropius wrote that in the past, in the era of the Gothic cathedral, sculpture, painting, crafts such as stained glass window making and architecture were all unified to make a complete building. He observed that in the industrial era, there was a fragmentation. Painting had become wall hanging, an end in itself, as opposed to being part of this complete environmental architectural unity. Same thing was true of sculpture. The early Bauhaus had the goal to bring the arts back together into the complete building, which would become an expression of our time. He said, "Today the arts exist in isolation. Architects, painters, and sculptors must learn anew the composite character of the building as an entity. The artist is an exalted craftsman. In rare moments of inspiration, transcending his conscious will, the grace of heaven may cause his work to blossom into art. But proficiency in his craft is essential to every artist. Therein lies the prime source of creative imagination." This early Bauhaus ideal found its strongest expression in a house near Berlin that was built for Adolf Sommerfeld. Here's an illustration of the house. The Bauhaus was divided into workshops: the metalworking workshop, the woodworking workshop, the ceramics workshop, and so forth. All of these workshops, with their master and their students, collaborated with Gropius on this home. This was immediately after the war. Building materials of the type that Gropius had worked with before the war, the iron, the steel, the glass, the linoleum, were in short supply. Part of the problem then was to deal with materials at hand, and there were forests nearby. So in a sense, this house looks like a geometric log cabin, doesn't it? It was built out of logs. Okay. These doors, carved by one of the students, Just Schmidt, demonstrates a couple of things. One thing it demonstrates is the notion of art, in this case sculpture or wood relief, being unified with architecture. It illustrates the notion of a revival of handicraft, these beautiful handmade doors. It also tells us that by the time of this project, the Bauhaus was beginning to be influenced by Russian constructivism and by the De Stijl movement. As early as 1919, they were aware of the De Stijl movement. It's a beautiful composition as you look at these triangular shapes moving up through the space and made with these various textured qualities that are carved into the doors. Here's a stairwell, and we can see the paneling, the tile work. We can see the sculptured reliefs on each level of the stairwell as you go up the steps. Very beautiful woodwork, again by Just Schmidt. So I think this illustrates Gropius's early vision, the idea that the artist, the craftsman, the architect can all join together and work together as a unit to create a new form of architecture that has the qualities that were lost because of the Industrial Revolution, and going back to this unity of all the arts that existed in medieval cathedrals. Everyone in this room has been impacted by the work of this man. This is Johann Itten, I-T-T-E-N. Itten was retained by Gropius to become the master of the preliminary course. Everyone at the Bauhaus would go through, in a sense, an art foundation program, an introductory program. In this program, Itten would attempt to unlock the students' creative abilities, to develop an understanding for the physical properties of materials that artists and designers work with, and to study the fundamental principles underlying all art. This was very different from the way art education was conducted at the time. I dare say that in Western culture, everyone who goes to any sort of art school or design school today enters an art foundation program that's a third or fourth or fifth generation spin-off of the Bauhaus preliminary course. Here's one of Itten's paintings, and we can see that he was involved in working with the pure visual means, studying and working with color, with shape, with texture, though this has no texture, but an exploration of the universal language and principles of design. Some student work from this preliminary course. Here's a series of 24 exercises by a student in which he's studying two things. One thing is the geometric division of space into three planes, then the relationship of planes of white, red, and black, and the various permutations that can be created, and the various balances that can be achieved through the asymmetrical placement of these three entities. Here's a work from the basic course in which a student has created a sequence of stripes and then cut a series of circles and rotated those in space, studying the visual phenomena that occurs when form is rotated and a new set of forms are generated. Walter Gropius proceeded to hire some of the most advanced artists in the world to come to his school. Artists that I dare say that most schools would not have touched in 1920, 1922 with a 10-foot pole. There was the Russian expressionist, Vasily Kandinsky. Kandinsky had come to Germany and was associated with the German expressionist artist. This painting, called The Church, was painted by Kandinsky in 1910. At first glance, this looks like a beautiful non-objective painting of colors and shapes that are blooming and moving across the canvas. When we look more closely, we see to the right a church steeple, in the lower right-hand corner tree trunks and trees, roads, trees, bushes, sky, clouds, some figures in the middle on the left-hand corner up here. The story goes, I'm not absolutely sure that it's true, but it's a wonderful story, that sometime around 1910 or 1911, the date gets a little fuzzy, Kandinsky had been out painting a landscape, and as an expressionist artist, he had been pushing his work more and more toward the language of form and color with less and less reference to his subject matter. He goes that one afternoon, late afternoon, he came in from painting all day, and he propped his painting over against the door and went and fixed himself a cup of tea. turned around to look at his painting, and he had propped it up on its side or upside down. So when he looked at it, he saw no reference to nature. He just saw the color and the form and the shape. And it was a revelation. So early in the second decade of the century, Kandinsky sort of moved back and forth between paintings such as this that are non-objective, non-figurative compositions, and paintings that did reference landscape and nature and interiors. Kandinsky developed a theory of art in which he said essentially that there is a language made up of point, plane, line, shape, and color. This language is just like any other language, the language of musical notes, the language of spoken verbal language, the language of typography. He theorized that meaning and emotion could be assigned to lines, to planes, to colors, and this could become a wonderful way to communicate and a wonderful way to generate messages, although not messages in the traditional verbal sense, but nevertheless messages that could allow an artist to speak to people through the expression of this language of form. Walter Gropius was very much interested in these ideas, and it led to Kandinsky coming to the Bauhaus to work as a teacher. Another advanced artist was a Swiss artist, Paul Klee, K-L-E-E. Paul Klee totally synthesized the modern movements. He understood and worked with ideas from Cubism, Fauvism, Futurism, Surrealism, Expressionism, and that's not all. He was very much interested in primitive art, children's art, all sorts of non-traditional visual expression. He assimilated all of this into works that become charged visual communications, paintings and watercolors that become signs and symbols that become very meaningful. Here's a portrait, and we see Cubism and Expressionism, but what we mostly see is Paul Klee. He was very theoretical in his thoughts about lines and points and planes and color and how they worked, and he taught this in the Bauhaus freshman program. It's one of Klee's ink and watercolor pieces called the Twittering Machine. It's a pure surreal invention. As we look at this, we see that there's a crank over on the right. You can turn this crank, and these bird-like creatures, very surreal birds that almost have the property of fishing lures. Their feathers become almost like hooks. And it's as though you can turn that crank, and these bird-like apparitions will start moving and will attract something. And there's a story here, but we don't quite have the punchline or the plot. We look at the base for the Twittering Machine, and because Klee has put this line right there, that one line turns the base to the Twittering Machine into a hole or a trap. And that